unfortunately, you find out pretty quick when you get out there. The chances of making a difference are far and few between. Taking drugs off the street and guns, you're not really making a difference. You're slowing down a problem at best. It wasn't until I got into the SVU unit and started working with the task force where we had some cases where we actually rescued kids. And that's when I finally said, I'm making a difference.
Can you introduce yourself for me, please?
Yeah, my name's David Syvock. I don't know what other introduction you want other than that, but that's who I am.
David, who did you work for?
I worked for two different departments. Originally, I started in 1988 with LA County Sheriff's Department. I stayed with them until 2005 or 6, and then I lateraled down to Newport Beach Police Department, where I retired from.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? Tell me a little bit about your family. And ultimately, was there something that led you to law enforcement?
Well, the answer to the last part was it wasn't the typical somebody in the family was in law enforcement. I was following the footsteps. I grew up in Orange County. I originally come from Minnesota. We moved out to Orange County when I was young, probably 3-4 years old. And I grew up in the Fullerton area. Family, my dad was a salesman. At one point he sold encyclopedias. I think he sold pots and pans for a while. But eventually he ended up going to work for Graco, which was airless spray equipment. And he was with them for a while. Then he went off and started his own business. He was a distributor for them. And that's where the family business was. I did some work for him. I just never really had an interest. When I was a kid in the summers, I would go down and work for him. My mom worked there. My older brother ended up working there until the business shut down. But I just never had any interest in that. And after I graduated, I was working for an Italian restaurant up in North Fullerton, Giovanni's Pizza. It's not there anymore. And I was going to college, just kind of dabbling in that, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. My major was business, and I was focusing more on hotel and restaurant management. I thought that's what I wanted to do, until I ended up getting a management position with Giovanni's and realized that the hours you work versus the compensation, it was a tough way to make a living. But what I did get out of that job is I had a lot of really good repeat customers. And one of them that I spoke to probably once a week, he would come in. And one day I sat down on a slow day and we were talking. And he said, "Hey, you ever think about being a police officer?" And I'm like, "Yeah, no, it never crossed my mind." And he said, "Well, I think you would do a good job." And I wish I could remember his name because I'd love to reach out to him, but I lost contact with him. But what ultimately happened is he said, "Hey, the LA County Sheriff's Department is having a test in a couple weeks. I think you ought to do it." I said, "Okay, why not? What else I got going?" So I went down to the academy there in Whittier one Saturday afternoon or Saturday morning and sat in a big room and took the test. And then afterwards went outside and we stood in the breezeway and there was hundreds of people there. And if they called your name, then you had to go across the street and do the physical agility test, which at the time didn't concern me because I was in really good shape, and but to my surprise, they called my name. And so next thing I was across the street running the course and passed that. And they gave me a background investigator and said, "Hey, they'll get in touch with you." So I immediately went into panic mode. And it happened to be right in the middle of the semester. And so I went back to college and started applying for law enforcement classes. And I was able to get through a couple of them. It took about a year to get hired with them. But during that time, I had taken some criminal justice courses and did all that to try and prepare myself. and as the process went on, it just kind of grew on me, and I got excited about it until I finally got hired in 1988.
So you really didn't know what to expect then. You hadn't been preparing for this career or anything.
Not a clue at all. Matter of fact, I think one of the questions they asked me when I met with my background investigator was, well, tell us what you know about the sheriff's department. Needless to say, I didn't know a whole lot. But for some reason, they gave me a chance and I ran with it. And next thing I knew, I was working off the street down at the criminal courts building in downtown Los Angeles and wearing a uniform, and there I was.
You took the test. I think it's really interesting. You took the test, and and this is all during the same day. But you take the test, and I'm assuming it's like, well, you've scored a certain score. Now we want you to go. So there were other people that didn't score that certain score, and they're like, "Yeah, go home."
That's exactly how it went.
Wow, that's
Yeah.
really interesting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
How old are you when you taking this test?
Well, I was probably just turned 20 because I turned 21 in the academy. I had my 21st birthday in the academy. The nice thing was that we were just about ready to graduate, so I didn't spend my birthday doing push-ups and getting chased around and in and out of uniform to suits and ties. But I did turn 21 in the academy.
Did you have to be 21 in order to be a deputy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So they knew, they timed it out for you.
Exactly.
So you get at it. Well, let me ask you this. You're 20 years old, never been in the military.
Nope.
How was that experience at the academy for you?
Shocking. Um, but you learn real quick that the academy is a huge inconvenience, is what it is. And if you get in that mindset, then you can get through it pretty easy. I mean, you realize that, hey, they're yelling at me because they yell at everybody. Don't take it personal. I had a really good academy partner, still one of my best friends to this day. And I think he had a lot to do with making it easier for me too, because Ed ended up retiring recently as a captain. He obviously knew what he was doing. His father-in-law retired from LAPD as a captain, so he kind of helped me get through that. And was able to get my head in the right spot. That once you figure that out, the academy's not that horrible if you're in good shape. And I think it really helped me, and I'm glad that I made that transition in college, even though for a brief period, and I took some criminal justice classes, because then when I got into the academy, it wasn't all so unfamiliar to me. So,
Okay.
yeah, but it was an eye opener. Yeah.
How about growing up? Were you into sports at all?
Yeah. Yeah. I played sports from a young age. I played basketball. I grew up at the boys club in Fullerton. I mean, I spent every day there. My dad was a coach. He coached our teams. I played Little League baseball in high school. I played baseball, and then eventually, because all the cool kids were doing it, I joined the football team, even though I had never played in my life. But I figured, what the hell? I mean, I'm here, and ended up, we were the CIF champions in 1985, 84, 85. So needless to say, I wasn't a starter. I spent most of my time on special teams and all that, which I was perfectly fine with. I mean, you just want to be part of the team so that you can get closer to the cheerleaders. So, I guess I had a motivation there, and it worked out really good.
Do you think sports helped you in the team aspect of policing?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, it not only in the team aspect, but also in the physical fitness portion of it too. I mean, spending time playing sports, you're constantly in the gym and doing all that. And even after I graduated, I would work at the restaurant until it closed at 10 o'clock at night. And at that time they had, 24-hour fitness. And so I would go from the restaurant down to 24-hour fitness, and I would work out until, 12 o'clock in the morning or so. So my biggest challenge was running. I was never a big runner. and needless to say, in the academy, you run a lot. Um, and so that was my biggest challenge, but I even came up with a way of beating that. The restaurant up in North Fullerton, there was a lake up there called Laguna Lake, and it kind of had a dirt track that went around the outside of it. And so I finally, back in the day when you remember the old Walkmans where you put
Oh yeah.
a cassette tape in
Yep.
there, and I start going out there every day before I got into the academy, and I put my Walkman on and I just ran that lake every day. Didn't enjoy it at all. But I did it because I knew the more things that you can tick off the checklist before you get there, the easier it's going to be.
Yeah.
If you don't have to worry about physical fitness, that's one thing you can set off the side. Um, if you don't have to worry about, the laws and the codes and all that, you can set that off and focus on the new stuff they're going to throw at you. And that's kind of how I approached the academy. And it worked out for me.
Did you have people at the academy that showed up that weren't in shape, that struggled?
Yeah, there were not as much so now as what you see. I mean, and I know we all say this, right? My dad told me he used to walk uphill in the snow both ways to school. Well, I found that out to be not true
Sure.
when he took us back to South Dakota and said, "Hey, here's my high school, and look, there's my house right there." And I'm like, "Well, there's no hills, and it's 100 yards." And I guess I could say the same. When I was going through the academy, it was a physical academy. There was no, if you couldn't do the running, they put you on a stationary bike during that time. So you did it,
Yeah.
So most of the people in our class were in okay shape at the worst. Some washed out. I mean, we started off with a big class and we probably washed out, 80 or 90 people out of the class.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, so when you get out of the academy, what's your first job?
I get out of the academy and I was sent to the inmate reception center, which was the processing center for the jails, for Men's Central Jail. Um, so I didn't have to work, the dorms and stuff like that. I was down during the processing and there's a whole bunch. I mean, from the original intake when the guys first come in off the street, um, and the first experience they get in jail is meeting us, and then you go through the processing and get them all the way through the system to where they go back and they're classified, to make sure that we're not putting Crips and Bloods together and or Mexican gangs with black gangs and stuff like that, all the way back through to the seeing the doctor or the nurse, and then from there they would go upstairs and be housed at Central Jail or any of the other jails if they're going to send them up to Wayside. So we processed that. The other thing that we did at the reception center is we processed all the courts every morning. We would have a court line where all the inmates from CJ would walk down and they knew where to go and they would be put in cells depending on what court they're going to. And then TST, the transportation unit, was attached to the inmate reception center. So all the buses were there and everything. And then we would get them all off to court. And then throughout the day, you would bring them back in and check them back in. So it's exactly what it was. It was a processing center.
Did you have a lot of interaction with the inmates where you got to kind of learn the lingo and maybe had some interaction that would later help you out on the street and got to patrol?
Whoa, yeah, definitely. I mean, you're seeing, like, if you work in Men's Central Jail, you may be assigned to one dorm, and that dorm could either house gang members or regular general population. And where we saw everybody. I mean, we saw everybody and anybody that came through into Men's Central Jail and out, they came through us up until the day they got released.
Any shocks to you when you're, a 21-year-old, you're working there? Any surprises like, geez, I didn't expect this?
It's funny because I don't remember any at this time. I think by that point, you're kind of almost desensitized to all that stuff. And once you get settled in, it's like going to work anywhere. You show up and do your job and you don't even think about it.
How about running into Richard Ramirez, Night Stalker?
Oh, that was before. That was my first introduction. A naive Orange County kid that never got in trouble and all that. And send me down to the CCB, the Central Court for LA, which was downtown Los Angeles. And I still remember the sights and smells of getting from my car to, there was no parking there. So you had to park down the street. And I don't know how much time you spent in downtown LA, but it's not the cleanest place.
No.
And so here I am, young kid, and I'm walking to work, stepping over homeless people, the incredible smell of urine everywhere. But the biggest shock was the first day I get there, I'm downstairs where the buses come in and you bring them in for courts. And I was told to go open the door for the van, and the high powered inmates would come in transported by themselves. They wouldn't put them in the van with everybody else. And so I go open the door, and the person standing in front of me was Richard Ramirez. And that was my introduction to my new job. And it was shocking, to say the least.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, it smacks you in the face with reality.
Yeah.
And I still remember that to this day. Yeah.
You mentioned this, and I was in downtown LA, a long time ago, but you started in 88, and you're there for a long time. What do you think happened? Because obviously downtown LA wasn't the greatest anyway,
Yeah.
but it's not what it is now.
Oh, no.
What do you think happened?
Well, without trying to get political,
Mm-hmm.
politics happened.
Yeah.
And we saw it every day. I mean, when I was working patrol, you saw it. You saw how politics didn't, what we dealt with and what they were saying on TV,
Mm-hmm.
two totally different things. We're taking guns and drugs off the street, and they're talking, oh, we got to get guns and drugs off the street and this and that. Well, the laws at the point were such that I could arrest a guy with a gun and dope, and by the time I finished writing the paper, he was already released. So the whole concept of tough on drugs and tough on guns, it was all, it was fake. It was smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
And I think that just continued to get worse.
Mm.
These people that make decisions about how to make things safe have no idea. None of them. I can't remember once ever having a congressman or a senator come out and say, hey, let's go on a ride. Show me what it's really like. They don't want to know. They absolutely don't want to know, but they want to make decisions. And we saw it with the defund the police, the most asinine movement that you could ever imagine. Yet they had people that were listening to them. People are very naive. And I think they do that to protect themselves from reality. If people saw what I saw when I was doing child exploitation, I don't know. I don't know that they could handle it.
Yeah.
And I'm getting off track here, but I mean, I sat in court and had to testify to a video that I watched. And I remember after testifying, looking at the court reporter, and she was visibly upset. And I had to apologize to her because it was extremely graphic.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's what happens is people don't want to know what's going on. They want to hear from these other people that are saying, oh, it's all good. The gaslighting,
Yeah.
what you're seeing is not really what's happening.
Right.
What's happening is everything's great.
Yeah.
And, that's just what happens. So politics is what happened.
So Dave, you go from working kind of intake. How long do you do that before you're on patrol?
So I was there for, gosh, I don't know. I was probably there for 11, 12 months. And then at that point, I had an incident with a use of force that we had in the inmate reception center one day with me and 3 other guys. And that led to an investigation where I ended up getting put on the bricks for a while. I was relieved of duty, and I had to go to a hearing to get back to full status. So then I did that for a while, and I can't remember how long that was. Once I came back from there, they sent me back to Civil Brand Institute, and I had to go and appeal to the captain there, saying, "Hey, I did my time in custody. I should be able to go out to patrol." And thank God I had a reasonable captain at the time, and he listened to me and he agreed. And so then I got sent out to San Dimas, or at the time I got sent to Walnut Station, and then I started my patrol career out at Walnut Station.
When you start on patrol, I'm assuming you're with a FTO.
Yeah.
How long does that last?
I think the FTO program was 6 months at the time.
Okay. So 6 months. And then once that stops, are you on one man or patrol 2-man cars?
Now, Walnut Station was primarily one man when you worked out of Walnut Station. So when I was down there, uh, although there was a station up in San Dimas, it was semi-closed, and all the units that were working what we called North County, which was Azusa, Covina, Laverne, Claremont, Pomona, if I didn't say that, they were run out of Walnut Station. When I first started, my area was Rolling Heights, and Rolling Heights was always one-man units. If you went up into the county area and you worked night shift, it was two-man units. Day shift, one man, night shift was two. So it was a combination of both. I primarily worked a one-man unit all the time. There was an occasion where I would work at nighttime. When I was an FTO, obviously I was a two-man or two-person unit.
Can you remember your first day as a one-man unit?
As I sit here, I can't. I can imagine that I was probably crapping my pants. Um, because, as everything, I mean, the academy doesn't teach you how to be a cop. They teach you how to stay out of trouble, hopefully. Um, but you don't really start learning anything until you're in a car by yourself. And then you make your mistakes and you learn from your mistakes and stuff like that. So I don't remember exactly my first day alone, but I'm sure I was a little bit nervous, to say the least.
When you start off with the sheriff's department, do you have any goals? Do you have any like, hey, I want to be a homicide detective one day? Or, at what point do you?
It's kind of funny because I never really did. I just kind of took it as it went. Kind of like how I got hired on. I just kind of took it as I went along. I think after a while, my goal was to become a detective. After I had spent, a significant time out in patrol, I wanted to be a detective. I interviewed for it once San Dimas Station reopened. I transitioned up because I worked a lot of the North County car towards my latter part at Walnut. So I transitioned up to San Dimas and worked out of there. Um, and I did. Then I wanted to be a detective. Obviously, pushing a radio car for your entire career is not the best way to go. I mean, it's hard on your body and stuff like that. But I would have
But
enjoyed.
in terms of what kind of detective? Did you have any goal?
I didn't even know.
Okay.
I had no idea.
Okay.
I just wanted to be a detective, when I interviewed and didn't get it, one of my trainees ended up getting it, and then they opened up the countywide cops team, which was a quasi detective spot. We weren't answering radio cars. We were dressed in soft uniforms and all that. And that was enjoyable. I had a great partner. I had a great partner at the time, and we had a lot of fun and put a lot of people in jail and did all that. But then I had the opportunity to go down to Newport, and so I just never pursued being although they offered it to me as I was walking out the door. They're like, "Hey, stay and you'll be a detective." And I'm like, "Hey, I've been here for 18 years. Now you're going to offer me this."
What kind of cases were you working on the cops program?
Any of the special problems they had there, I mean, one I remember was we had a prolific tagger. Tagging was big back then, and we had a prolific tagger that was going on and just absolutely annihilating the city of San Dimas. I mean, the high schools were getting completely tagged overnight, and
And for the audience, tagging is graffiti.
I'm sorry, yeah, I apologize for
Oh, okay.
that. And I wish I could remember what his moniker was. and it slips my mind right now. But we worked on that case for quite a while. And I had a partner, David Flores. He ended up retiring as a captain too. You notice everybody I worked with got promoted. Um, but he was a great part. We had a lot of fun. And I think that's why we were so successful, is that we had fun doing it. Going to work at that point was like going out to the bar. It was just fun. We had a great supervisor, and the only criteria we had was you have to work 40 hours a week. You know when to put your hours in, so you guys come and go. And we did. We didn't take advantage of it, and had a lot of fun. And we ended up, I wish I could remember it was, and it's right there on the tip of my tongue. Maybe it'll come to me. And I remember how we caught him too. It was on day shift because we had set up surveillances at the school. We sat up on the roofs of the schools at nighttime and never had any luck with it. And we get a call, or we hear a call over the radio of somebody tagging a trash can behind the Bank of America in San Dimas. And so we start heading over there. And as we head over there, some guy is pointing, he went that way, and we saw the guy running, and we ended up catching up to him. And once we had him in custody, we went back to see what he was tagging. Lo and behold, it was our guy. And so we ended up, we were able to put all the cases on him from everything we had documented, and we learned quite a bit about the art of graffiti at that point. And there's two different types. I mean, graffiti, there's the graffiti artists that are out there doing their murals, and then there's taggers. There's the guys that are trying to get street cred, and they would get points or scores for where they tagged. If you tagged a highway sign, an overpass sign.
Okay, so wait a minute.
Yeah.
I have a question about that.
All right.
Because I'm down in LA and I see that.
Yeah.
How do those guys do a
Man,
highway sign
I don't know.
without getting caught?
I don't know. I mean, that's the lifelong, question. How many licks does it take to get the center of a Tootsie Pop? We don't know. But, they've fallen off there too. And it's crazy. I don't know. I wouldn't do it because I'm afraid of heights. So
Yeah.
I'm like, now I'm going to get points for that.
Yeah.
I'll do anything on the ground. But yeah, they would get credit for where it was at, and they wanted to get their moniker as far as they could. And that's why they would do the trains, because the trains are going to be traveling and they're going to be seen for long distances.
Wow.
But yeah, we ended up getting him. I found out years after, probably after I had retired, or maybe right before I retired, he ended up getting shot and killed outside a bar in Pomona or something like that. So he's no longer with us.
Do you remember how does a prolific graffiti artist like that, what's his sentence? I mean, you guys pin a whole bunch of stuff on him. Do you remember?
It wasn't significant.
Okay.
No, it was, I think he got probation, and they hit him for restitution or something like that. And I even remember he had to pay the city, and the city didn't want to meet with them. So my partner and I went out and got the check from him and delivered it to the city. And it wasn't near enough to cover the damage he had done, but it was the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you go from the cops program, you start working the community action team.
Yeah.
What are you doing there?
It was the same concept as cops. When at one point cops got dissolved, they went away from the cops program because they needed deputies in other places. And they just kind of looked at, that's one of the areas we can pull deputies from. So we were going to have to go back to patrol, but the city of San Dimas said, no, we like the format. We like having some there. So they ended up taking, there were 3 deputies, me, my partner, and then one other individual who's he claimed to be the lead, although he was the laziest one there. And then we had 1 sergeant. Don't get me started on Ed, because he was a piece of work. And so we took over doing that, and I ended up getting us into doing subsidized housing fraud, which was huge because San Dimas, Azusa, Claremont, or not Claremont so much, but Covina, they had huge apartment complexes. And until we got into, I had no idea, but they were all subsidized housing. They were either through HUD, Housing Urban Development, or LA County had their own subsidized housing stuff. But it was insane. It was a 6-year waiting list to try and get into an apartment. It was generational. So you would go into an apartment complex and there would be families for generations in there, and they lived off that system. Well, the federal arm of that, HUD, as well as LA County, they had guidelines that you had to live by. If you're on subsidized housing, if you have a 2-bedroom apartment, I don't know why they'd give them 2-bedroom, but they would. But you're not allowed to have anybody live in there that hasn't been approved. Well, we had parolees that were living with grandma and doing their dope and stuff like that. And you would walk into these apartment complexes in the summertime, and it would be so cold in there because they have the air conditioning running. You could hang beef in there, but all of it was free. It was all subsidized. You'd go into the parking lots, and there would be Cadillac Escalades and, I mean, big screen TV, and they lived off the government. So we would go in and we put lists together of violations for the different apartments. Well, then we got together with HUD and we had some friends there, and we would put a big operation together. And we're thinking, cool, we're going to get rid of these people. And you wouldn't, because they're the federal government. And let's go back to your question earlier. What's wrong with this? The federal government starts subsidies for things that are supposed to be short term. That's not true. They last forever. If the federal government starts a subsidy, it's going to be there forever because they don't want the appearance of throwing people out of their house. Even though they violated every rule that was put in place, very rarely, I think we got maybe 2 evictions. And that's the way it is. That's the truth.
Yeah.
I'm not making this up. I sat there and I saw it, but we put our cases together, and it made an impact because now the gang members that were living with grandma, the dopers that were living with grandma, they realized, hey, these guys are watching us. So we did make an impact on that. And we ended up coming across some bad people in doing so because you would come across somebody that you didn't even know you're looking for, and they would have warrants for murder and stuff like that. So, it was a good tool for us to get into houses or apartments that we knew had bad people in them. And every now and then we got lucky and we got a bad person. But we certainly didn't solve the crime of subsidized housing fraud by any means. That still continues.
How do you start? 2 questions here. How do you start working on Avalon or at Avalon? And can you explain to the audience who wouldn't be familiar with LA, where Avalon is and essentially what you were doing over there?
Yeah. So to start off with, for those that don't know, because there were a lot of people that didn't know that Avalon was not only part of LA County, a lot of them didn't even know it was part of California. But that was typically the drunk people that didn't realize that, because they would ask you, hey, what time's the boat to California leave? I'm like, well, you're in California. But anyway, so I was working patrol. This was before I went on the CAT team.
But just sorry to interrupt you, but Avalon is Catalina Island,
yes,
which is an island off the coast of California.
Yes. So Catalina is the island.
Okay.
Avalon is the city.
Right.
And then on the backside of Catalina is called the Isthmus. And that's another small city in itself, but it's very primitive. That's where all the sailboats go and stuff like that. So the city of Avalon is where all the bars and hotels and all that stuff.
Okay.
Well, they had a small station there, and they had a lieutenant, a sergeant or 2 sergeants, and maybe 5 deputies to patrol this city. And then they had their own dispatch center there, but they put out a notice saying, hey, we need 1 deputy to come over for the summertime. And what they were looking for is a new face, because all the bad people on the island, and there was a lot of drugs and stuff like that out there, but they knew who the local deputies were. and they knew how to avoid them. The local deputies maybe didn't enforce as hard as they should because they had to live on the island with these people. And so they wanted a new person to come in that nobody knew about. And I put in for it, and surprisingly I got it. At the time I was married, we didn't have any kids. My wife was a dispatcher at Newport Beach Police. And so I would go over, and I think I worked a 312. So I worked 3 days a week, and then I'd come home. And so I went over there, and it was right around 4th of July is when I started. And they said, "Hey, just go out in plain clothes and see what you see." And so I went out that day, and I think I found a missing little girl and stuff like that. But I just kind of got familiar with the area. Well, then after that, I was in uniform, and their biggest problem was, believe it or not, a group of kids that would stand on this corner, and they called it Horny Corner. And I'm sure it's because I'm not lying. I'm not making this up. I don't know if it's in any history books, but it was there. And I'm sure it's because where all the kids would go to meet up and hook up and stuff like that. But it was right in the center of town. And these kids would cause problems with the tourists. And they're like, "Hey, take care of this problem." And I said, "Okay." So every day when I got on shift, I went and stood right on the corner of Horny Corner. And that's what I did. And eventually, I ended up befriending some of these kids and stuff like that, which worked out great for me because then they would tell me everything. Kids like to talk, and they would tell me everything. They'd tell me who has a warrant. If I knew somebody had a warrant, they would tell me where they were at. And and so I ended up having a pretty good summer. I lived on the island. They had a apartment complex up the road from the station, but I learned pretty quick that if I just stayed in the bunk room, it would be financially beneficial for me because at the time, LA County had a deal where if you got called out, it was 4 hours overtime, a minimum. Well, at nighttime, there's only one deputy working, and sometimes he would need backup. And so the dispatcher would run upstairs and knock on the door. And I always had my gear right there. And she would say, "Hey, so and so needs backup." And I would throw my stuff on and go and come back and get my 4 hours overtime.
Hmm.
And then I also found out that I arrested somebody. There was a jail there, but they had no jailer. So I would arrest somebody and they would sit in the jail, and then I would get off and they'd be like, "Hey, you want to be the jailer?" I said, "Okay." Then I took it a step further and found out that I could transport them over to the mainland, either by the Catalina Express. The V-Haul boats had what they called a captain's room in them. It was like a suite that you could rent. Well, if it was vacant, I could take my prisoner up there, and they would transport him over to Long Beach, and then I would have one of the units from Lakewood Station or one of the stations meet me there, take them, and then I would go back. Or the Harbor Patrol, which was a non-sworn Harbor Patrol, had a boat, and if we couldn't get into the Catalina Express, we would go on the Harbor Patrol boat, which was interesting because there's no seats on it. It's a hard deck. And so you would basically put a life vest on them and secure them to the deck, and off you would go. Um, it was a little bit nerve wracking because you think, man, if I go overboard, I'm a giant sinker. I mean, I've got 25 pounds of gear on, a bulletproof vest, and so you didn't want to do it on a night that was stormy.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because I would get overtime. We get paid during this whole trip. And sometimes, if it was late, my wife would show up and pick me up. I would go home and stay at home at the night. And then she would bring me back the next day. I'd get on the Catalina Express and go back to work.
How was that experience in terms of community policing? I mean, it seems like you're in this very small community.
Oh yeah, you definitely had to make sure that you treated people right. Um, you didn't want to have enemies. You wanted to have friends there because if things went sideways, you didn't want people to say, "Oh, good, he's getting his ass kicked." Um, and I met some really nice people there.
Yeah.
After I left, I kept a relationship with some of those people for years after. I would get invited back to the Christmas party at
Hmm.
the year and stuff like that. So I had a good time with it. But I wouldn't want to stay there for an entire career. I
Yeah.
mean, the island's very small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you were with LA County Sheriff's Department for how long?
Was there for right around 18 years.
Okay. So why do you leave? You're 39 years old when you leave for Newport PD. Why do you leave?
Well, because it got frustrating after a while, trying to promote. And at the time, LA County, and they may still be, they were under a consent decree at the time. And there was a lawsuit by a female over not being promoted. And it was huge in the courts, and it resulted in her attorney now reviewing all promotions within the department. And they came up with a formula that they had to promote so many females over, within this group of males. And so a lot of times, you would get passed over because of this consent decree. And it just got frustrating. And at the time, now I had been married to my wife for several years. She was a dispatcher at Newport. I had played on their softball team for a number of years, and I had talked about going down there, but we kind of both came to the decision, hey, that's her place, this is my place. Well, then we had our first child, and she went part time, and she said, well, hey, I'm only part time. If you want to go, go. And I'm like, okay, well, thanks for waiting until I'm 39 years old, not in the greatest shape of my life. But yeah, let me give the physical agility a shot. And so I applied for it and got accepted. I had to run the physical agility test, which damn near killed me. I still remember that last. It was a run. I don't like running, and I was running. It was a timed run, and I remember looking over my shoulder, and there were two gals that were coming up behind me, and I just kept telling myself, "I'm not going to let them beat me. I'm not going to let them beat me." And it pushed me over. I think I made it by like 3 seconds. And then after that, I thought, where's the nearest hospital? I don't know that I'm going to survive this, but I made it. And got sworn in and went down there. I had to go back to patrol, obviously. Um,
Let me ask you something
yeah,
before you go on. And I don't want to make you do hard math here, but talking a little bit about the consent decree and hey, we have to have so many females. What do you think the breakdown of LA County sheriffs at the time in terms of the percentage of women that were the totality of the department?
yeah, far more males. It was very male dominated, so you didn't have as many females. Um, so those females, and nothing against them. I'm not
Yeah, no,
I'm
I
not
I, I get that.
trying to. So they obviously got a leg up on it, and I'm sure I don't know the whole deal with the lawsuit that went on. I don't
Okay.
know what that was about, and maybe there was some credibility to her complaint, but there were far more males, but they had to push all these females. So females were advancing much quicker within the department than males were.
But you have a less of a population, less of a percentage of the females that are on the job, and maybe you don't know. Are they saying we now have to have 50% female supervisors?
I can't remember what the breakdown was,
Okay.
but it was not. It may not have been that extreme, but it was a certain amount had to go. So with every promotional list,
Hmm.
they had to make sure that there were a certain amount of females that were on that list. And it was a graded test. And
Yeah.
so if you were a female that maybe didn't do so well, but they needed to get you up there, you got up there. And guys that had better tests would get passed over.
So essentially, you had taken the test to get promoted several times, and they just kept passing you over. Or
Yeah, I had taken it for the sergeant's exam. I think I took it once or twice. For detectives, I took it once and got passed over by a female trainee that had far less time on the department than me.
Hmm.
Um, and so it was kind of at that point, it was almost like a perfect storm because that happened. My wife went off on part time and she says, then go.
Yeah.
And I knew a lot of the guys at Newport from playing softball with them. Great department. Um, I mean, the best equipment. The equipment in LA County, not so much.
Hmm.
I mean, they had radio cars that they were piecing back together with other radio cars. Newport Beach was all top notch stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and it was interesting because going back, I remember my interview, and And one of the questions they're like, well, we don't have all the activity like in LA. We don't have the shootings and stabbings and this and that. Aren't you going to be bored? Let me tell you what, the stuff that goes on in a rich bedroom community is insane. I mean, I saw crimes that I couldn't even believe the things I'd seen.
Hmm.
So it's interesting,
Yeah.
and they get their, Newport had a lot of people come in from other areas, transient. Not like transients like homeless people, but transient population. The summer times, the beaches were filled with people from the Inland Empire, gang members from the Inland Empire. Um, you would have thieves from LA County that would come into Orange County because, they're thinking, wow, rich community, Fashion Island, and they would come down and commit their crimes and then take off out of the city. So it was busier than you would think.
Yeah.
So, but, it was just the perfect storm at the time where, my wife was comfortable with it. I was saying, hey, if I'm going to do it, now's the time to do it.
Yeah.
And it just happened to work out.
So you start on patrol, and then you go to bike. Did you go to bike
Yeah.
unit then?
Yeah. Bike unit was a function of patrol.
So tell me what you do on a bike unit.
Well, bike unit consists of two things. One, you're on a bike, as it says, a mountain bike, and you patrol the beaches, the boardwalks in the summertime. In the wintertime, you would go up to Fashion Island. And it was a benefit because, people doing bad things aren't looking for somebody riding up on a bicycle. They're looking for radio cars and all that. So we were able to get into places on the bikes that cops can't.
Mm.
The other thing you had was the ATVs on the beach. So, we would take the ATVs and we would be down on the beach and out on right down by the ocean. And so it gave you a unique perspective of what was going on down there, and you would see a lot of stuff. We were able to move around a lot more on the peninsula. Radio cars often got stuck in traffic. In the summertime, the roads are gridlocked, where we would be able to get to things either on our bikes or on the ATVs.
Yeah.
So I did that for a couple years. It was just a change of pace. It was still patrol, but it gave me a chance to get out of the radio car.
Yeah.
And so it was a nice break.
So tell me, how do you get to SVU?
Well, it's an interview process.
But why SVU? Why not homicide? Why not? I'm assuming they have other.
Yeah. So for me, it was I just wanted to get up into detectives. Okay, and Newport Beach has everything broken up. Um, they don't have a homicide unit. I forget what they were called, but they handled all assaults, attempt murders and all that. They handled that, home takeovers and all that. That was that unit. You had your burglary team that handled nothing but burglaries. And at the time that I started and got promoted up there, they called it the juvenile unit, the juvie unit, because we handled all juvenile crimes along with sexual assaults. And then after a while, we're like, well, we're doing mostly sexual assault. We should be an SVU unit. So the name changed while I was up there.
Mm.
So going back to your question, I just wanted to get up to detectives. And it happened that a desk in that unit opened. And so I interviewed for it.
Was there a plan? Hey, I'm going to become a detective. I'm going to go to this unit, and then I want to eventually end up X to wherever.
Not really, because the way it was in Newport is the detective spots were all on rotations. And I want to say they were 3 or 4 year rotations. And after that 3 or 4 years, you would have to rotate back to patrol and then re-interview for another job. Unless you were within 3 years of retirement, you could put in for, I forget what they call it, where you could extend for your last 3 years. So if you were 3 years away from retirement working detective, you could put in for a preferred assignment and you would stay there until you retired. They wouldn't force you to go back out to patrol. And I didn't, once I got into the special victims unit, I was very comfortable there. I liked what I was doing. And it got even better once I got involved with the two task force I told you about, the ICAC, the Internet Crimes Against Children, and which then led me to be cross-designated with Homeland Security for the Orange County Child Exploitation. And what was unique about it was, and I'll go back to when I first did my interview with LA County, and the age-old question, why do you want to do this? And your response as a 20-year-old kid trying to impress somebody is, well, I want to make a difference. Well, unfortunately, you find out pretty quick when you get out there, the chances of making a difference are far and few between. Taking drugs off the street and guns, you're not really making a difference. You're slowing down a problem at best. It wasn't until I got into the SVU unit and started working with the task force where we had some cases where we actually rescued kids. And that's when I finally said, I'm making a difference. We had, without getting too far off, we had a group of girls in the Philippines, a small village outside of Tacloban. There was a teacher from Orange County that was traveling abroad for sex with minors. And we ended up with that case. And we watched these children from this village being molested from, and if I'm getting
No, no, no. I want to talk about all this. This is
we watched these children started with Polaroids that he was taking, 3.5 floppy drives, just to give you an indication how far back this was.
Yeah.
And then it moved up from there to computers, thumb drives, and all that. But we identified these children when they were still in diapers. And then we watched them grow up through these images. And I remember still now sitting at Homeland Security, and we had a box truck of evidence that we had to go through. It took months and months to go through this evidence. And we had a board, and we had the names of the kids, and we watched them grow up. And that case went to federal court because, for those of you that don't know, you can be charged in the United States federally for traveling abroad to have sex with minors. So jurisdictionally, it was ours, and that case went through the court system in federal court, took years, but we all eventually got a conviction, and 3 of the victims flew in. We brought them back from the Philippines, and they testified. And afterwards, we got to sit down and have lunch with them and talk to them. Well, now they were at the age where some of them had kids of their own. But we were able to see the end result of what we did, because once we got him, he no longer molested these girls. And we ended up getting a sentence of 198 years in federal prison. And that's when you realize, that you finally made a difference. We made a difference in their lives. I mean, sure, they were still victimized and they're going to have scars forever, but now they're leading productive lives of their own with children of their own. And they were molested by their mother, who was getting paid by him when he couldn't make it there. So, I mean, it was pretty horrific, to say the least. We ended up losing a partner over this.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. I definitely, I want to talk about kind of the effects of these type of cases that take their toll on guys like you. But before we get there, was there a typical kind of case that you worked at SVU?
Well, yeah, I was in charge of sexual assaults.
Okay.
And any case involving a minor, whether it's child abuse or anything like that.
Okay.
So primarily I had to do sexual assaults. And my patrol area, or my area of influence, was the peninsula. And anybody that knows Newport Beach, there's one thing on the peninsula, and that's a lot of bars. And that would lead to a lot of drinking. And then, either coming back on Monday, it wasn't if, it was how many am I going to get, where the gal met a guy at a bar and things happen. And then I had a lot of cases like those. And they're challenging because, you have to listen to the victim, but then you have to figure out the whole story,
Right.
and I had females that um, filed cases against the guy because they had stepped out on their boyfriend that night and the boyfriend found out. And so then they would claim rape. And so I would have to track that down,
Yeah.
and it's a very delicate thing to do because, you're talking about a serious crime and you can't accuse the victim of doing this,
Yeah.
but you have to follow the leads. And
Right.
when it comes down to it, that's what it ends up.
Yeah.
So I dealt with a lot of that, Um, I had some cases that, went to trial and they were legit cases that needed to go. Um, I had one that was in the news, a guy that was living here. I think he was from Iran. Ragragi was his name. Big, big guy. And I started getting a bunch of these cases where these girls were meeting him up at the bars, and he was allegedly giving them drugs to then rape them. Um, and I ended up finding a video, and it was pretty graphic, and he was sentenced and went to jail. So you do have cases that are legitimate, but there's some that they're not, unfortunately.
Did you have a specialty when you worked on these cases? Were you good at computer forensics, or were you good at interviews? What was kind of your thing that you, I don't want to say like to do, because can't imagine anything liking to do with this stuff.
I
But
did,
okay, what
and I
was it?
did like to do it.
Oh, okay,
My thing was interviews,
okay,
and the reason that I liked it was because it was my challenge to get them to admit to what they had been doing. Because every interview we did, unbeknownst to the subject, they were video recorded, audio recorded, and we would have a key fob that we would set up, and I would do the interviews. And my goal was to make them feel comfortable. It was not a hostile interview, and get them to tell us what it is they were doing in graphic detail. Because I knew if we could get there, that if that video was ever played in court in front of a jury, there was no way they would be found innocent. They would never be acquitted because they were graphic in detail, and we had to sit there and pretend like it didn't bother us. Um, and it does. You just don't show it at the time.
mm-hmm.
Um, you're focused on your goal, and your goal is to put this bad person where they belong. And so I enjoyed doing that. Um, and I was good at it. Um, I didn't have, I mean, I could probably count on two fingers the number of times I left an interview room where I didn't hear everything that they had been doing, every video that they watched, their favorite video of child exploitation that they watched. I mean, this is what they would tell me. And I enjoy doing that.
So when you start talking to these guys, well, let me ask you this, because I say guys, was there a percentage? Did you ever interview females?
Yes, we considered a female involved in child exploitation and is very similar to finding a unicorn. It didn't happen a lot, um, but it did.
Okay.
Their motivation, and I think maybe we had two, three at the most. Their motivation was a man. They were trying to please a man, and so regardless of how disgusting and sick this was, what they were doing, their goal was to allow the man to do this because they wanted to appease the man. So it wasn't them looking to get sexual gratification out of this. It was them trying to please somebody else to then be accepted by them.
Hmm.
We did come across it, not very often.
What about the men? You've interviewed numerous hundreds of people, I'm assuming. Did you ever come to a idea of why these guys do what they do? Because
Uh,
most people in society go, "This is disgusting. I
yeah.
can't." What was the problem with these guys?
They're just sick. Their wires are crossed to where they can't make that differentiation between this is wrong. I need to stop. Their urges drove them to do it.
Was there a percentage of them that had been abused, which led to their further abusing people?
Not as many as you would think.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's not an excuse then.
No.
Hmm.
Well, it's an excuse
Yeah,
for the
yeah,
ones. Even the ones that were abused, it's an excuse because if you were abused and obviously you didn't enjoy being abused, why would you turn and abuse somebody else?
yeah.
Um, but no, that we didn't have that a lot. Not as much as they try and portray, on TV and stuff like that. It was just a sickness.
Mm,
These guys weren't wired right. They didn't realize or didn't understand that, abusing children was wrong, and they couldn't help themselves.
yeah.
Yeah.
These type of cases that you're working on, you find super rewarding. Was it exponentially even more once you started working at the federal system with the ICAC? Did you feel like you were doing even more because you were working on bigger cases?
Oh, for sure. Our area of reach just expanded. I mean, we ended up in part of the team flew to the Philippines to do the interviews there. I was in London in 2014, 2015 teaching. We had a computer program that we used to track IP addresses that were used in the peer-to-peer network to download and distribute child pornography. And I was trained on that program through ICAC, the Internet Crimes Against Children unit out of LA. One of my good friends was one of their lead detectives there. And we took a team to London and spent, I don't know, 18 days there twice, 14 and 15. And we put on classes for Scotland Yard, um, the Queen's Royal Marine investigators from Scotland, and we would fill the room with investigators from the UK, and we taught there. And um, because of this computer program, we could see how bad the problem there, and it was horrible. I mean, we put on classes. They were 3-day classes, and so 18 days. We would fill every 3 days. You would fill a new class. There was not one investigator that didn't leave that room or that class without a minimum of 10 cases. And I'm talking solid cases of people that were prolifically downloading and distributing child pornography.
So this isn't just an American problem. This is a worldwide problem.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
And in our program, you could see, and I don't have access to, nor do I want, it's been a long time since I've been on it, but we had a program that you could pull up the map and the map of the world, or you could narrow it down to a specific area, but you could pull up the map when we're in the UK and you could hit the button to start and it would start populating with dots of everybody that was currently online at that time downloading or distributing child pornography
Wow.
or child exploitation material. And you give it a few minutes and the map was just covered.
Mm.
So, and you could go anywhere and do it. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It was something else.
For the audience, can you explain what ICAC is? ICAC.
So ICAC is the Internet Crimes Against Children. And and it's still going. It's federally funded. And it's a task force and there's an ICAC here in Idaho. Idaho has a ICAC that's out of the U.S. Attorney's Office, I believe it is. And they're all over the country. They're all federally funded, and their goal is to go after people that are using the internet to find children to abuse. And the low-lying fruit in that is the ones that are downloading and distributing child indecent images. And we always said child pornography, but if you look at the definition, pornography is legal, right? Well, child pornography is never legal. So we transitioned into indecent images of children or child exploitation images and stuff like that. There was nothing legal about having these images. So ICAC ran out of LA, um, and they focused primarily on the area of LA, although they would every now and then come down into Orange County until Homeland Security started a unit there called the Orange County Child Exploitation Task Force. And they were based out of the federal building in downtown Santa Ana. Well, they were doing the same thing. And the two worked together. So, we were getting a lot of federal funding for equipment and stuff like that. Well, I transitioned over to the Orange County unit because I was working in Newport. So I needed to change my sphere of focus from LA cases to Orange County cases and ultimately cases in the city of Newport Beach.
Mm.
So you had those two units. They were both ICAC had Homeland Security, postal inspector investigators. I don't know if they had any FBI agents. They might have. The Orange County Child Exploitation Task Force, it was investigator from Orange County Sheriff's Department. There was one. Homeland Security, we had a number of special agents from there. We had a postal inspector. We had one FBI agent on our team, myself, and a couple of the other Orange County agencies were involved, but we didn't spend, or they didn't spend a lot of time with our team. They were kind of on the outskirts. If a case came up in their area, they would call and we'd go over and help them. So yeah, that's what we had on our team. Yeah.
So, Dave, you describe this job, particularly the SVU stuff, as the most destructive but most rewarding job you had. Tell me how you dealt with these cases mentally, because I can't imagine that they're easy.
Yeah, it's weird, and I shared an article that my daughter wrote her freshman year at college up here that really dives into the issue of mental health in law enforcement, and it's very tricky because if you say that you can't deal with stuff mentally, the first response from your superiors is going to be, well, get them out of there, get her out of there, which could ultimately be more destructive. So what we had as a team is we had a way of coping with this. We'd go out and do a search warrant. And after every search warrant, the team would get together and sit down and have breakfast together. Not talking about the cases, just sitting. We all became family. I mean, we knew about each other's families. Sorry, my throat's getting dry. And we would do that. Well, then aside from that, we would have mental health days, and we got paid, but we would go do stuff away from work, a beach day, a bonfire, Knott's Berry Farm, stuff to get us away from it, to try and give us that little bit of a break from what we're seeing. I mean, there's days, to give you an example, you do a search warrant, you recover, thumb drives, cell phones, computers. It's going to go to our forensic lab. They're going to triage that stuff and give it back to you or set you up in front of a computer. And then it's your job as the investigator to scroll through tens of thousands of images.
Okay, let me ask you a question about that, Dave. So I've spoken to homicide detectives, and they say in the beginning, some of them in the beginning see a dead body and it's like, oh, it's a shock.
Yeah.
But as you go by, it just becomes easier and easier.
Yeah.
Does your work ever become easier?
It does. And when I say it becomes easier, it's easier while you're doing it at the time because you're focused on the end goal. And the end goal is to find the bad guys and put them in jail. It's when you leave there that you discover how destructive it is. But I mean, we're going through images so much that we're seeing the same images over and over and over again. What we're looking for is the images we haven't seen. And because what we're ultimately looking for is live victims. These guys will start downloading and sharing child pornography and feeding their sick urges and stuff like that. But after a while, they start getting desensitized and they're not getting the thrill out of that. And so then the next step from there in progression is going to be to find a live victim. And, whether it's just chatting with them and then they do that for a while and then that excitement starts to wear off a little bit. They get dulled to that. And then their next goal is to ultimately meeting this person in real life and victimizing them. So when we're looking through these tens of thousands of images, we're trying to pick out the needle in the haystack of the ones we haven't seen before. Um, and we found them a couple times. And it's not something that we found a lot of, but we did. And that's when the rewarding part comes in. You then can save somebody's life at that point. Um, and so that's what you strive for. I mean, that's what you focus on, and that's what keeps you going, and that's what the most rewarding part of my career is when you find those live victims, as sad as it is,
Hmm.
you're going to make a difference in somebody's life at that point.
Did you ever find a case or live victims where somebody had been essentially kidnapped and held to be abused?
Well, other than the ones in the Philippines,
Hmm.
but they weren't kidnapped. I mean, he was flying there, and they knew he was coming. But
Yeah, I
he
just
he would take them to, like, there was one victim that he took to a hotel. So he took her away from from the village that she was living in, and I think if I remember the images correctly, she might have been in her early teens. But there were images of her in the shower with him, and you could clearly see that this wasn't something that she was enjoying.
I just think maybe I'm just thinking Hollywood worst of the absolute worst, where you're going from victimizing kids or people in situations like this to actually kidnapping them and holding them and then just abusing them that way
The
for.
the closest that I had to, and it would be considered kidnapping, was an individual that I found that was living out in the valley, um, and he had driven to Newport Beach to meet a young girl that was communicating with him. Um, but they never left her house. She was living with her step parents, I think, and he abused her there.
Mm,
But in that case, I found out there was another girl out in Riverside County that he had actually driven to, picked her up from her house in Riverside County in the middle of the night, drove her back to his place in the valley, abused her, but he ultimately returned her home. Amazing that she got back home, but
yeah.
I mean, that's how far they will go.
How about counseling for you guys? Did you get counseling?
No, we didn't, and that goes back to what I was talking about before. And I mean, for the most part, our system worked. I mean, we took care of each other, and we always checked on each other. I mean, I had my partner, who is one of my best friends to this day. My daughter wrote about her in the article. Matter of fact, this incident that I'm going to tell you about, where we had gone into a double wide trailer, and um, we found a young girl who was mentally and physically handicapped in the back room. And for some reason, she had kids herself. Whatever it was, something triggered her, and she was the lead on the case. And I remember looking at her, and I saw a look on her face that I had never seen before. And so I immediately removed her from the situation. And we got outside, and she broke down. I mean, whatever it was, it had triggered her. So we looked out for each other. We looked for signs and stuff like that. Um, we weren't 100% successful at it.
Yeah. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, and that goes back to the case involving the Philippines. And I'm not going to use his name out of respect for his family and all that. But one of our agents was Filipino. And he went on the trip to the Philippines to um, interview the girls. He was familiar with the area. He had spent time in the Philippines, so he was the one that should go. Took some other people with them. We came back. They came back from that. We went to trial, and during the trial, and he had a role in that. He was going to have to get up and testify. Had a beautiful family, two daughters of his own. He was very active in the family life. Um, but something happened, and I got a call one Monday morning that he took his life. Um, and, it was right during this trial. So, and we never saw it. We had no idea.
Mm.
Um, the whole team got together that afternoon and we sat down at a restaurant out in the Inland Empire on a back patio and we looked at each other and asked, did we see anything? Not a one of us. And we're all trained investigators. But whatever it was, and I mean, he planned it out. It wasn't a spontaneous thing. The last phone call that I got from him was the Friday before, and he was calling me to update me on another case that I was working on with them. And I didn't think anything of it. I think I had been off IOD at that point. I had neck surgery. And so I'd kind of been out. So I just figured he was calling to give me an update on the case. And that next, maybe it was Tuesday because he went in on Monday and left everything on his desk. So it might have been early in the morning on a Tuesday then. But I had no idea,
Mhm.
I mean, I had a smile on his face every time you saw him. He was the first one to help you. Um, the one thing we noticed in retrospect was those breakfasts I tell you about. A lot of times he didn't show up at them. He would say, I got to go back and do this or that. And so he wasn't there. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but, as investigators, and we're trying to figure this out, that's the only thing that all of us came up with is, he didn't always show up at the breakfast with us.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it was devastating. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Can you can you discuss a little bit? We want to talk about kind of society's roles in this, but you had mentioned when we spoke schools and churches.
yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Um, well, I mean,
I mean, to put it in context, you had said schools and churches typically have concerns, but they won't say anything.
schools mostly. We had two big cases that involve teachers. And in both of the cases, the schools claimed or intentionally were ignorant to what was going on. In one of the cases, there was a complaint against a teacher at a high school, and there were a couple girls that came forward and said that he was inappropriately touching them during this after school program that he was running. And the school chose to instead take him and transfer him to a middle school.
Mm.
So instead of having him in this school where you have kids that are older and more likely to come forward, they then turned and put him in a school um, where you had young kids and primarily Hispanic kids in downtown Santa Ana. Um, and he ended up molesting a girl there.
Yeah.
And it was completely preventable. So, the churches, my last case, I retired in 2016. My last case, I just finished in May of last year. And so for anybody doing the math, that's 8 years after I retired, I finished my last case. And that was involving an individual that was working, or not even working, he wasn't being paid, but he volunteered to work in the youth ministry area of a church in Anaheim, Anaheim Hills area. But his whole reason for that was to gain access to the girls. And he befriended a family there, and they had two little girls. And remember, I told you when we looked through those images, we looked for the ones that we didn't recognize. And it just so happened it was a case that I had got him downloading and distributing child pornography with the computer that I was using, and he was in my city. And so obviously it was going to be my case. I had the lead on it. And while I was interviewing him at his house, my forensic examiner for the computer came in and said, "Hey, you need to see something." And I went out and saw these images, and they were of two little girls, maybe 7 and 9 years old. And he was wrestling with them taking selfies, but his focus was on private areas of their body. At that point, we didn't find any like any images where he was physically um, actively abusing them, but it was enough there that I'm like, we got a problem here. And he identified him and claimed that it was nothing. But then I tracked it back down to the church and sat down with the senior members of the church, and they explained to me that, yeah, we knew he was in here working, and we had talked to him about the way he would spin the girls around on his shoulders. He would set them up facing him, and then he would spin them around that way. And we talked to him about it, and and we eventually moved him out of that area. Eventually, well, it had been too late because he had already befriended the family. He would go and babysit for him, and ultimately abused them. And I interviewed the parents when we were down doing a forensic interview. I sat in a room and interviewed them, and they basically attacked me, saying, he wouldn't do this. Todd Hartman wouldn't do this. He's godly and he's this and he's that. And I'm like telling them what I'm seeing and what I saw, and they wanted nothing to do with it. And we ended up going to federal court for the images on that because the girls didn't fully disclose anything enough that we could charge them in state court. So we took them to federal court. In federal court, we got more sentencing for possession of child indecent images. In state court, it was almost 100% probation and register as a sex offender. No jail time at all, regardless of how many images they had. If they were just what we considered the commercialized, state court, probation, and register. So federal court, we could get time based on the number of images and videos.
Yeah. So there's a real lack of punishment in the state system.
Oh, horrible.
That's
in California.
Okay. That's what I was going to ask you. And I don't know whether you know the details, but is it just a lack of punishment in California state level, or do other states have this same issue?
I know that there's other states that are tougher because I followed some other cases. California, no.
Why do you think that is?
Remember, go back to what I said earlier, politics. But
you think that would transcend politics?
You would think it would, but it doesn't. But then again, these people that are making these decisions are not sitting down looking at the images that we're looking at.
Yeah.
And so once again, they want to be naive to this, and they want to think that these people can be rehabilitated. And, yeah. So
how much time did your church guy get?
Well, so I'll try and give you the Reader's Digest. So we went to federal court with it, and we ended up in front of a very liberal federal judge that picked our case apart because witnesses claim they saw things that they couldn't see. There was no physical way but she took that in. And then one of the images in federal court, it's weird because if your gun is exposed during an interview, it's bad. Even though we're cops wear guns, but the federal courts made you cover your guns while you did these interviews because they felt it was threatening. Well, it was one of the issues in my interview. My gun was exposed. And so she picked apart. He claimed that the first guy through the door used his AR-15 and put it in his chest and pushed him backwards, which anybody in law enforcement would know you will not present your weapon to somebody like that. It doesn't make sense. But this judge used that and ended up picking our case apart to where we had to dismiss it in federal court. And so off he goes back out on the street. What happened, though, thank God, is my two victims that originally didn't disclose, they had moved out of state. And when they got out of state, they disclosed to their parents what he had done to them. And he had continuously abused them physically for years. And the parents, called him and he admitted to it. They emailed him. He emailed back an apology. Well, that reactivated the case to where now we could take it into state court. And that was the call that I got from Ron that I said I wasn't going to say his name. That's
I'll edit it.
the call I got that Friday before we lost him was that he was updating me that they had disclosed. And so then we took it back into state court. And the other thing that happened during that time, I had found 2 other cases involving him that never got prosecuted. And they were 2 young girls out of Fullerton. I had never met them before, but I pulled the cases up and I presented it to the DA saying, hey, we have continuous abuse here. And they put those cases in with ours. So we ended up with 4 live victims on it. And we went to trial, and it was drawn out. I mean, this was a 2015 case that got adjudicated in 2024. My 2 victims, I never saw them again. One of them gave an impact statement via Zoom from whatever state they're in now. One of the other 2 victims that I didn't meet, one of them came to court and gave an impact statement that just blew us away. And I got to meet her. And I still stay in contact with her. She obviously had a very difficult life because of what happened to her. He continuously abused her, led to drug abuse and not such a healthy life. The good thing is she's now living a healthy life. So, yeah.
So how much time did the guy get?
4 life sentences and 140 years.
Perfect.
Well, you think? Do you know about the laws in California?
Oh, well, 4 life sentences means what? 5 years? I mean, what are you going to get ultimately?
There's an individual out in California named of Gavin Newsom that passed a law a few years back, and it has to do with seniors in prison. And even though if you go to any restaurant nowadays, you're not considered a senior until you're 65 now, used to be 55. His is 55. So once you hit 55 years old in California, as long as you have served 10 years of your sentence at 55, you're automatically eligible, and it might be 20 years, 10 or 20 years. You're automatically eligible for parole, even though you've been sentenced to life.
Wow.
So Todd, I think we arrested him. He was probably in his mid 40s. By the time we went to trial, no, he was in his 30s. By the time we went to trial and convicted him, he was in his mid 40s and got convicted. And so once he hits 55, as long as he served 20 years of his sentence, he's eligible for parole.
Holy crap.
Even though he's got 4 life sentences.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're hoping it's not automatic. He's not automatically going to get parole.
Yeah.
But he's eligible for it. Yeah.
Crazy.
So, and I think I did the math at it. He would end up at maybe 58 years old where he hits his threshold for that 20 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So kind of ironic.
Dave, tell me how law enforcement affected your family.
Well, I mean, my immediate family now, we've been in law enforcement. My wife was a dispatcher for Newport Beach.
So do you think that helped?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the things, part of our goals when I was working on the task force, if we had to go out and do periodic internet safety presentations at schools, for parent groups, for teacher groups and stuff like that. And a lot of times, because of the way my wife and I raised our children, she would bring them in to work with her because she would work nights, I would work days. She would drop them off. They would either sit and dispatch and watch her or come over to my desk. But if I had a presentation, I would take them with me. And so they listened to all of this stuff. And, it obviously made them safer on social media as they were growing up. They would share with their friends, hey, you probably don't want to do that. But both of my kids are now going to serve. My daughter is going to be a nurse here. She graduates in May at Boise State. She's slated to be in the top 10 students, seniors at Boise State academically. My son chose to join the Idaho Army National Guard at 16, 17 years old when he was a junior in high school. He did his summer between junior senior year in basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is not a vacation hotspot by any means. He came back from there, finished his senior year, and after that was sent off to Virginia for his AIT, his advanced individual training. He started at Boise State while he was in Virginia. He had to do it online until he got back, went to the dorms. He's now a sophomore at Boise State, and he wants to become an attorney, but he's still actively involved with the Idaho Army National Guard.
What kind of attorney does he want to be?
Not a defense attorney, I can tell you that. That might cause problems.
Okay.
No, my son would never. I guess they got their purpose in life, but
Yeah.
that's not what he wants to do.
Okay. How about this? Can you look back on when you started your law enforcement career till now? How did being in law enforcement affect the way that you see people in society?
It's interesting because while you're in law enforcement, you obviously, everything you do is, I got to keep my head on a swivel and this and that. And at least the initial part of your career, you typically don't have a lot of friends that are outside of that arena, which I don't think is super healthy. I think as my career went on, I started having a lot of friends that were outside of law enforcement. Um, to even now where, the majority of my friends that I have up here are outside, but it still doesn't change things. I mean, my wife still jokes about it. We go to a restaurant and you know which way I got to sit, you know, unless I'm there with somebody else that happens to be in law enforcement and they sit down first. At least I know somebody's looking at the door.
Yeah.
So it does kind of make you look at it that way.
But how about this? When as particularly in the SVU unit, one thing that you had mentioned to me was like Little League. It changes the way you interact.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I coached Little League when my son was going through it, and it just the way you interact with the kids is you're very aware of it. You don't touch them in a certain way. You don't put yourself alone with them. And it's not that you would ever have it's the perception.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure 99% of the people, the parents on the teams wouldn't even think twice about it, but it's my perception.
Yeah.
And so you avoid that stuff.
But how about this? Being in that position that you had, do even now, or maybe it's kind of faded away a little bit. Did you look at people even out in public going, I don't know, just kind of looking at them and going, I don't like the way that you're interacting here, or maybe did you ever have that?
Not so much in public, but what I see on TV.
Okay.
And there's one person in particular that makes my skin crawl every time I would see the way he interacted with children. I mean, literally made my skin crawl. And it just is. And I mean, I've seen him. I spent 6 years talking to him, and when I watch this, it just makes my skin crawl. And so that's all I'm going to say about this individual.
I know exactly who
Yeah.
you're talking about. I just thought it was really, every time you'd see him on television, it's so bizarre.
Oh, it's disgusting. And then the stories, he would tell the stories, about the kids stroking his legs and playing with the hair on his legs, and it's like, stop, and these parents that would push their kids in.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't focus on him. I would focus on, hey, where is his hands and stuff like that. And all I can say is it made my skin crawl.
Mm.
It was disgusting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even if nothing was happening there,
Right.
it was highly inappropriate.
Right.
And so, yeah, I do see things in a different light that way.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for people that want to go into law enforcement?
Boy, it's a different world nowadays. it's a lot. I mean, we have the social media, we have the live streaming, the cameras and stuff like that. And my advice to people that want to go in law enforcement, I'll tell you, it was a great career. It's different now than it was when I went through. Um, but you don't have to be a hard ass to people. And the old saying, you get more bees with honey, you know. Um, don't be afraid to interact with people. Um, and have conversations with them, and consider the spirit of the law sometimes even more so than the letter of the law. um, and it'll make your career a lot easier, because we've got so many people that are against us. And when I say us, I'm not in the business anymore, but against law enforcement. Why not pull more people to our side?
Yeah.
And hey, these are good people. Yeah, I did something stupid, but I was treated fairly. And I think that's what people want, is to be treated fairly. And the more we can do that, maybe the more we can get away from this stigmatism that we've been dealing with. And I think we're coming out of it.
Yeah.
I've seen some changes recently where that nonsense is starting. People are starting to see, hey, wait a minute, but yeah, you just really, and you have to treat every contact like you are being live streamed,
Yeah.
because the chances are you are, you know.
So, Dave, one thing that I really admire about you, I love a craftsman,
Uh,
right?
yeah.
So, what do you do now?
Well, we're sitting in my shop, and it's not something I just started after retirement. Uh, I had two careers. While I was working in law enforcement, I had that career, but I also had been involved in fine finish carpentry, cabinetry, and all. And I ran a business the whole time I was a cop. And it's something I have just always done. And so when we moved up here, I built a shop. Me and Jim, who just walked through the back door there a little bit, and a couple other friends, and we built this shop here. And now I still do carpentry. I build custom barn doors. I do cabinetry. I do a little bit of everything. And then I built this nice area back here with my wood burning stove that later in the afternoon, my wife will come out and we'll have a cocktail while we sit by the fire. So,
Do you want to? You don't have to. Do you want to mention the name of your business?
it's K&C Custom Woodcraft.
Okay.
It's not like I need any more business. If the camera was turned around and you saw what my shop looked like,
I'm gonna video and I'm gonna take some pictures. So
it's there's a few projects going on right now. So yeah, I never have a lack of work. I don't advertise anywhere. It's all word of mouth. And since we moved up here 6 years ago and got our name out there and start doing work, the phone hardly ever stops ringing. So yeah. Yeah.
Dave, thank you very much for the interview. Really
It
appreciate
was
it.
my pleasure. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.